continue on, and so now let's talk about coexistence next. So I'm sure most of you know this, but I'll just say this anyway. The basic definition of coexistence is simply when you have some users in Office 365 and some users on premises. And when you're in that configuration, your Office 365 users see the same global address list as your on-premises users, and email ends up being seamlessly routed between those two sets of users. And in a coexistence environment, your MX record and the point at which mail gets flowed in and can point to either on-premises or Office 365. We don't have a requirement either way. We give you full control to make the decision as to which way you want your mail routed. And that's important because some customers have unique messaging policies or compliance issues or journaling needs that require, for example, all of their mail flow to flow through their on-premises environment before it ends up going to one of their cloud users. So that's what we mean when we say coexistence. Now, in a simple coexistence environment, the DIRSync that we've been talking about is used for the GAL synchronization, global address list synchronization. And as I mentioned, that is there so we can provide a unified GAL, no matter who is viewing it, and email routing using that shared SMTP namespace. And this can be used with cloud IDs, this can be used with federated IDs, and the simple coexistence story does not require you to do things like, for example, deploying an on-premises hybrid server. So just a quick recap on Mailflow pre-coexistence. So here we have up at the top there, we've got an external mail sender, and they're going to be sending mail to John Doe at contoso.com. So the sending server is going to look up the DNS MX record for contoso.com, and it's going to deliver it to the external facing contoso.com email server. That server is going to do a lookup to figure out where that user's mailbox is located, and it's going to then deliver that message to that user's mailbox. And that, of course, is how mail flows for most Exchange organizations on the planet today. So let's talk about what happens after coexistence. So now we've got routing from on-premises to Office 365. So it's the same on-premises mail deployment. We've got the DIRSync appliance in there now. We've got a mail coming from an internet user again. It's destined for the same user. It's going to come into the Exchange server based on the MX record. The Exchange server will then do a lookup, try to find out where that user is located. It'll find that, in this case, the user is mail-enabled and not mailbox-enabled. It'll look up the primary SMTP address to figure out where to send it to, and then it will also look up the target address as well to figure out what the actual endpoint for this message should be. Once we know what the target address is, we're going to do an MX record lookup for that, and you can see that'll be for the contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com address. That MX record will be pointed to Exchange Online, and the Exchange Online server will pick up that message, do a lookup as to where that user is located, and then deliver that message into that user's mailbox. Okay, so that's your basic mail flow routing when mail is coming in from the internet, going through your on-premises organization, and then off to one of your users in a coexistence deployment who happens to be located in Office 365. All right, now what happens when we're doing a coworker email? So this isn't coming from the internet. This is a message sent, in this case, by this user right here, and that user is going to be sending a mail over to Jane Doe. So what we'll do is, again, we're sending the message that goes through the Exchange server. The Exchange server is going to do the same lookup that it did for any messages destined for Jane Doe. It's going to find out that here's her address and here's her target address. It'll look up the MX record for that contoso.mail.onmicrosoft.com, and it will look up the MX record there, send that over to Exchange Online, and Exchange Online will go ahead and deliver it to that user's mailbox. Pretty simple and straightforward mail flow routing. All right. One more. Now we're doing routing the opposite way. Now mail is flowing into Office 365, and it's going to be routed to the on-premises environment. So here we've got a user in Office 365. They need to send a message. They'll go ahead and send it to john.doe@contoso.com. And then we'll look up the target address for that. We'll see it's the same as the user's SFTP address, john.doe@contoso.com. We'll do an MX record lookup for that, find the authoritative server to deliver that to. It'll be the internet-facing Exchange server in this case. That's on premises. That Exchange server will then do the lookup to figure out where that user's mailbox is located, and it will go ahead and deliver the mail to that user. So again, there's no requirement to have things set up one way or another. And quite frankly, there's also really no best practice as to which way to do it. The way in which you configure your MX records and the way you choose to route your messages are going to be dictated squarely by the business requirements of your organization. Again, if you have a requirement that all of your messages have to be, for example, journaled by an on-premises server, then all of your mail is going to flow into your on-premises organization, and it will be seamlessly routed to the Exchange Online users for those sets of users that are in the cloud. But by converse, if you choose to have all of your messages routed through Office 365, which many customers choose to do because they get the benefits of things like Exchange Online protection as a result of doing that, then you can go ahead and change your MX records accordingly and route all of your messages that way. All right, let's talk about migrations. Now, from the coexistence perspective, we've talked about the two requirements that we have, the DIR-sync requirement and establishing mail routing. So we've gone through both of those. And of course, there's that one underlying requirement that I mentioned earlier, which is the necessary introduction of your vanity domains or your custom SMTP domains in Office 365. So now that we've covered coexistence, now we can talk about the migration phase itself. Now, when we talk about migration, the first thing that we usually think about in terms of the migration is the planning aspect, because there are a lot of questions that each organization needs to answer to figure out how they're going to do the actual migration. I mean, this is where you start looking at your environment and answering just a few basic questions. So, for example, what size is your organization? What are your coexistence requirements? What provisioning process are you going to use? What's your existing messaging system, in other words, the source servers of the migration? What identity management solution do you want to use? Do you need single sign-on? What time to value are you looking for? Are you going to allow users to do self-service migrations, or is this going to be an IT admin led type of migration? All of this comes together to help you form your deployment plan. So things like the source server, the organization size, the organizational requirements, all of those are going to be factors that you'll use when choosing your actual migration options. And those are going, again, to be unique largely to every organization. The provisioning method is often dictated by the option that you choose. For example, a cutover migration doesn't support DIR-sync, whereas a staged or hybrid migration does not only support it, but they require DIR-sync. And identity management will also be part of the deployment plan, but that doesn't always affect the choice of your migration solution. So here's a summary of the migration tools and options that we have for Exchange Online. All customers are going to have choices as to how they want to move to the cloud, and that can be something that's done quickly. It can be something that's done with native migration options, and this will allow them to take really a more measured approach to the cloud according to, again, their business requirements and whether or not they need to maintain mailboxes on premises or online for any specific periods of time. We do have a single management experience with our tools and APIs across all of the migration sets. So, as an example, the first column there, we can do PST migrations, and we can do PST migrations from a large variety of messaging systems, including non-exchange messaging systems. Now, a PST migration, that's basically an importing of archived or offline email. And it's also something that users can do on their own. You set them up with an empty mailbox. They have a PST, which is an export of their messages from whatever messaging system that they were using. And at their convenience, they use the Outlook client to go ahead and import and drag and drop those messages into that mailbox. IMAP migration, that's also supported from a variety of messaging platforms. But even if you're running Exchange, an IMAP migration is actually a pretty quick way to migrate. But it is limited. IMAP migrations support only email messages, so they can't be used to do things like move calendar items, contact items, tasks, and things like that. So it's sort of a low fidelity type of migration when you think about it that way. Stage migration would be the next option, but those are designed for Exchange 2003 and Exchange 2007 only. So if you're running anything else, any other version of Exchange or any non-Exchange platform, you won't be able to do a stage migration. And then if you're running Exchange 2010 or Exchange 2013, then our recommendation would be the last type of migration, which is what we call a hybrid migration. And that is a very high fidelity type of migration that will migrate everything for you. And it also is really designed for those types of coexistence and migration processes that are going to be very long term. Things like a PST or an IMAP migration or even a cutover or a stage migration are typically short term. They're not designed to be migrations or points of coexistence that go on for very long periods of time. But a hybrid configuration is something that can really exist indefinitely. And you can migrate in a hybrid configuration both ways fairly seamlessly. You can migrate onboard to the cloud, or you could offboard from the cloud back to on-premises as you need. So let's talk about some of these options here. Let's talk about IMAP migrations first. So as I mentioned, the IMAP migrations, they are possible with a very large variety of messaging systems, including both on-premises systems and hosted systems. So any service that you may be using internally or externally that supports IMAP can be used as part of an IMAP migration. And when you're doing an IMAP migration, you can migrate your users in batches. And because it's an IMAP migration, you don't have to install any tools, any migration tools in your on-premises environment. Again, it's a very quick way to do that. Now, to perform an IMAP migration, there are some requirements, though. You have to, for instance, allow access via the IMAP ports to your email servers. So that's going to be TCP 143 for a regular IMAP, or TCP 993, which would be preferred, which is secure IMAP. You do have to configure your vanity SMTP domains inside of Office 365 first before you can move. And then the process involves creating a CSV file that has your user information in it. You also do need to provision your users in your mailboxes before you can migrate as well, because you're basically creating an empty mailbox and then migrating the data, the mail data in at that way. Now, in terms of access to the source mailboxes, you've got two options there. You can either have the end users provide you with the individual passwords, and you can use those as part of the migration, or if you happen to have administrative credentials that provide you with full data access to all of the mailboxes, then you can just use a single admin account and have the migration happen under that account as well. Which one you choose, again, is going to largely be based on your company's business requirements. Now, what gets migrated? All mail messages get migrated up to a certain point, up to a maximum of 500,000 items and a maximum message size of 35 megabytes. You do also have the ability to exclude folders from migration when you are grabbing mail out of the source mailbox. So for example, if you didn't want to migrate the deleted items folder or the junk email folder, you can exclude those from that migration process. Again, as I mentioned, contacts, calendar items, tasks, these things are not migrated. Also, any folder names that you happen to have in the IMAP system that have a / in them, those are also not migrated. Now, this isn't going to apply to everyone, but there are some organizations, and in fact, many universities in the United States, that is common for them to be using /, and those folders would not get migrated. So keep that in mind. You may have to do some folder renaming before you do the migration process. And in fact, because folders with forward slashes don't get migrated, it also does conversely provide you with a pretty quick and easy way to filter out folders that you don't want to get migrated, because you just add a forward slash to them and boom, they are now excluded from migrating. And again, it is a 35 megabyte message limit, so if there are any messages that are larger than that, they simply will be excluded from the migration process. Typically, messages that are that large because of attachments, and you have the ability, of course, to go and save off those attachments into the file system and maybe migrate them through SkyDrive Pro as one example, as a way to get them to the cloud. And in doing so, after you save off the attachments, you can remove them from the mail item and get that mail item under 35 megabytes so that at least the mail item and perhaps some of the attachments can be migrated through this process. So the flow basically goes like this. You'll provision the users and mailboxes in Office 365, and then, of course, you'll need to assign licenses to them. You'll gather those required IMAP credentials. Again, that could be the individual user credentials, or it could be a super admin credential that has access to all the mailboxes. You will configure the IMAP endpoint. Again, there will be the proper TCP ports. You have to have connectivity to the internet from the IMAP server. And you'll prepare that CSV migration file. Then inside the Exchange Admin Center, you'll run the migration wizard, you'll enter the server settings for your IMAP source server, and you'll upload the CSV file that basically contains the username and passwords. And then a full sync is initially run, and then every 24 hours a delta sync is performed, so if any new mail comes into that mailbox after you've done the full migration, that mail will then subsequently get migrated to the cloud after that. Once all of your users have been migrated, you basically migrate your MX record. It's a DNS change where you'll now point to the cloud, and then you'll mark the migration as complete and then do any final syncing and final cleanup that you need to do. Let's look a little deeper at this process here. So looking at a slightly different view, you can see, for example, you have the ability to migrate your users in batches. And that's actually something that we recommend. You don't want to put all of your users in one single migration. You do want to do them in batches so that you've got greater control over it. And that is one of the things that differentiates this type of migration from, for example, a cutover migration, which is specifically designed to move everybody at once at the same time. Now you can see I've color-coded a couple steps there in orange. And again, if you're colorblind, I'll just point them out, these two steps. These two steps are steps that you would basically repeat over and over until all of your users are migrated. And then once that happens, then you can move on to the next step, which would be reconfiguring your MX record to point to Office 365. The other steps that are in yellow there are typically one-time tasks that you do during the migration process. Now, in an IMAP migration, as I mentioned, the cloud service itself is going to need to connect to your IMAP server using IMAP connections. And so you need to make sure that this can happen. This might mean some firewall adjustments, especially if your IMAP server wasn't already visible from the internet to begin with. IMAP can work without encryption. As I said, you could do it on TCP port 143, but we do highly recommend using secure IMAP and going over TCP 993 instead. The migration does not create the user accounts automatically. That's something that the admin needs to take care of. And the users can be added manually, one at a time, or you can import them from a CSV file, or you can use DirSync to populate it as well. Now, if your email server can be configured to use only one dedicated account to download the emails, then use that dedicated super admin account. That will be the easiest way to do it, and you don't have to get passwords from your users. If it's not possible, so for example, in the case of a hosted IMAP environment where you don't have a super admin account that will give you that, then you would need to collect the user passwords and have them individually put into the CSV file as part of that migration process. Now, I mentioned that IMAP migrations can be done in batches, and so that not only gives you the control over the migration, but it also allows you to just quickly test the migration process using a very small group of users. And then once you've finalized that group, then you can move on to your first set of production users and so on. The CSV file itself, that's going to contain the email addresses of the target mailbox, the user account that's used to log on to the IMAP server, and the password that's associated with that account. Now, although the CSV file can contain up to 50,000 usernames, really the best practice is to do these moves in much smaller, more controllable groups. As a best practice, though, because the CSV file will contain passwords, you want to keep it in a secure location, on a secure file server perhaps, maybe even something that's BitLocker protected, so if that disk gets stolen, it cannot be used by the thief. Now, the initial sync itself, that can be started at any time. It's not going to affect the users because they'll still have access to their mailbox. And then, as I mentioned, there will be incremental syncs that will also take place so that if any additional mail comes in after the full sync has been done, that additional mail can be migrated as well. So really, the biggest impact to your users is when you do what we would call the big switch. And that is when you go ahead and you're changing the MX record to point away from your on-premises IMAP server or your on-premises messaging system over into Office 365. And then it's at that point, once you've done that, then you would be instructing your users to start logging into Office 365 and abandoning the old messaging system that they were using. All right, let's talk about SEM, staged exchange migrations. So staged migrations, they are the what we would consider a fairly simple and fairly flexible migration plan for those customers who are running Exchange 2003 or Exchange 2007. They are very high fidelity migrations. All mailbox content ends up getting migrated in a staged migration. And staged migrations are typically geared towards medium and large organizations. And as a result, there is no limit to the number of mailboxes that can be migrated in a staged migration. So just as we've talked about before, the users end up getting pre-provisioned with DirSync prior to you doing the migration. And then they can be migrated in batches of up to 1,000 users per batch. Your identity management, that will still be performed on premises. That's not something where we'll switch you to the cloud. But to do that, you don't need to install any on-premises migration tools. So it is, like I said, very simple and very flexible. But it does require 2003 or 2007. If you've already moved on and you're running 2010 or 2013, then a staged migration would not be available to you. And of course, it wouldn't be available if you're not running the non-Exchange platforms as well. So to do a staged migration, there are some requirements. We actually use Outlook Anywhere to migrate the data. So what that means, of course, is you have to enable Outlook Anywhere, or in the case of Exchange 2003, you have to enable what we called RPC over HTTP in order for you to do the migration. And in addition, because it is using Outlook Anywhere, it's really RPC over HTTPS. And so because it's SSL secured, that certificate has to be issued by a public certification authority so that the cloud service has the ability to authenticate and validate that certificate. So for those customers who may have deployed their own internal PKI, you still will not need to purchase a certificate to do one of these migrations. And then there will be a super user or super admin account that ends up getting used for the migration, and that account is going to have, at a minimum, receive as permissions, but ideally full access permissions to every mailbox that you intend to migrate. And just like some of the other migrations, all of your SMTP domains must be configured in the tenant account, and DirSync must also be enabled. And actually, the process will look at your configuration in the wizard, and whether or not DirSync is enabled is going to dictate the actual options that you get in the wizard. So for instance, if DirSync is enabled, then a staged migration will be your only option. If DirSync is not enabled, then a cutover migration will be your only option. So if you're planning on doing a staged migration, again, DirSync has to be enabled ahead of time. And in a staged migration, the other caveat is that only simple coexistence is possible. You can't get things like shared calendars or shared free busy information as an example for you. So it's a very, very simple coexistence type of solution. Now, the migration batch file uses a CSV file, and that's going to be one user per line with a maximum of 1,000 users in each file. And before you start the migration batch, the migration tool is actually going to validate that each of the users that are named in this CSV file exist in your tenant as a mail-enabled user. And if it's not found as a mail-enabled user, then you're going to get an error that gets displayed, and you have to actually correct that problem before you can submit that batch for migration. Now, password, as you can see, that's one of the values in the CSV file. Password is going to be the password that ends up getting set on the new cloud mailbox. So any password restrictions that might be applied to your cloud-based organization, they also apply to the passwords that would be included in this CSV file as well. One other thing to keep in mind is you can see from the asterisk for both password and force change password, if you are using password sync, which again we recommend, then you actually don't need to include those in the CSV file. Those are simply not needed. And if you're using single sign-on, you would leave that blank as well. And in fact, if you are using single sign-on, the force change password has to be set to false. Otherwise, it won't work. And so that's what we mean by the asterisk there as well. So as I said before, this is a high-fidelity migration. Emails and folders, rules and categories, calendar items, contact items, tasks, out-of-office settings, delegates, folder permissions, and Outlook settings, things like your favorites and so forth, they do end up getting migrated. However, mail-enabled security groups, dynamic distribution groups, those do not get migrated in a stage migration. And in addition, things like the system mailbox, the dumpster or deleted items, as we call it, and send as permissions are also not migrated as well. And as is the case with all of our migration tools, there is a maximum message size limit of 35 megabytes for the messages as well. So any messages larger than 35 megabytes would not get migrated through this process as well. Now, there are some additional limits that you need to be aware of. You can't do what we would call a partial migration. And by that, I mean you can't filter or exclude folders. So anything that's in the mailbox is going to go ahead and get migrated in that sense. But not all mailboxes can be migrated. If the mailbox is enabled, it cannot be migrated. If the mailbox is marked as hidden, it cannot be migrated. Now, if a mailbox is marked as hidden, there might be a good chance that it's not being used, and you might not want to migrate it in the first place. But a enabled mailbox is a slightly different story. Obviously, if you've enabled a mailbox, it's because you wanted to give the unified messaging service to that user. So what you end up having to do is you need to disable the mailbox, then you migrate it to the cloud, and once it's in the cloud mailbox, then you enable it. So there may be a slight outage that user has to go through, and that, depending on how often and how much your users rely on that may be something where, again, you're migrating on the weekend or on off hours to avoid a disruption in service for them. But perhaps the biggest pain point is that you're migrating to a new mailbox. Okay, which means that new mailbox has a different GUID from the mailbox that the user was previously using. And what that means is you have to create new profiles in Outlook for the user. It also means that you'll be using a new OST file as well. The existing OST file simply cannot be reused when the mailbox GUID has changed. And so what that means is not only are you creating a new OST file, but you're resyncing a complete OST file as well. So if you have large mailboxes, this could take a lot of time and it can consume a lot of bandwidth. Now, one of the cool new features that we have in Outlook 2013 is this slider control that allows you to control how much mail actually gets synced down to a user's OST file. And that can be anywhere from all of the mail in their mailboxes to perhaps only 3 months worth of mail. So that would be potentially a way to mitigate the complete resyncing of a very large mailbox down to an OST file. And that's particularly helpful if you have followed our recommendation and bought into the value proposition of deploying large mailboxes to your users. Especially if you've just migrated, say for instance, 1,000 users, and they all had 10 gigabyte mailboxes, and they're all coming in on Monday morning to suddenly resync a 10 gigabyte OST file. That could be a bit of a pain for you to have to deal with. So there are some mitigating strategies that you can use, and that slider control in Outlook 2013 is one of the ways to do that. Another way to do that, if you're not using Outlook 2013, would be, of course, to construct the batch files in such a way that you had a nice balance of mailbox sizes in that batch file. So you weren't moving, all of your large mailboxes at once. You maybe move a few large and a few small and a few mediums together and try to balance out the workload in that way. But again, there's just no way around it. There's no way to use the existing OST, so it will be a complete resync of the mailbox for all of your Outlook users. Now, if you're using, unless you're using a password sync, then the administrator also is going to have to distribute a new password to each user as well. If you're using password sync, this doesn't apply, but if you're not using password sync, then every user is getting a new password to go along with their new mailbox. And then users will then create a new profile against Office 365 using their username and this new password. And then at that point when their mail gets downloaded to their new OST file. The other thing is the admin also has to configure the on-premises mailbox and convert it to a mail-enabled user. That will result in the on-premises mail being deleted at that point, so keep that in mind. You may decide to take a full backup of all of that before you go ahead and make that change, because at that point, once you do make that change, all that mail data is then gone from your on-premises environment. So the process to do a staged exchange migration is fairly straightforward. So you'll start by doing things like configure Outlook Anywhere. So if you're not already using Outlook Anywhere, that means enabling it. It may also mean obtaining a certificate from a public CA. Again, it's got to be a public CA. You cannot roll your own in this case. And then once you've done all that, especially if you're configuring Outlook Anywhere for the first time, we do recommend that you use the remote connectivity analyzer to verify that Outlook Anywhere is working for you. Of course, if you have a mail client that you want to configure to only use Outlook Anywhere, that's one way to validate it. But if you don't have such a mail client, then you would want to use the remote connectivity analyzer, which is just at www.exrca.com. Then at that point, you'll assign the migration permissions. You'll do things like configure DirSync. And then inside the Exchange Admin Center, you'll run the migration wizard. As part of running the migration wizard, you will create a migration batch. That's the block in red there. And then you'll begin migrating your users. Once the batch is complete, you can delete it, and then you can assign licenses to the migrated users. And you can see these four middle steps, the yellow and red that are sort of in that red box there. Basically, what you end up doing is you repeat those steps until all of your users are migrated, and it's at that point when you would go ahead and change your MX record to point to the cloud. There's a lot more details than we have time to talk about it, so I've got links that cover all that stuff in the notes of this particular slide as well. But let's look at some of the details, though. So when preparing for a stage migration, once again, the first thing you're going to want to do is go into Office 365 and add all of your SMTP domains and have them validated and verified by the cloud. The stage migration does need DirSync, so you will have to enable and implement DirSync, and at that point, it will create the necessary user objects in Office 365 for you. DirSync will also make changes to your migrated user accounts in your on-premises AD during the migration. And then after the migration is complete, you can deactivate DirSync if you want to, or you can keep it running. It's completely your choice as to where you decide to do your identity management. Then at that point, if it's not already enabled, you would want to go ahead and configure and validate that Outlook Anywhere is working properly. So in a stage migration, we're going to move the users in batches as you've defined them in the CSV files. And as I mentioned, you do need to create a migration administrator account that has permissions to read the data from all of the user mailboxes that you plan to migrate. And when you define the migration endpoint on the Exchange Online portal, this account needs to be defined along with the server name and the number of simultaneous mailbox moves that you'll allow. Now, as a best practice, we do typically recommend migrating work groups or teams of users or teams that use delegate access all in the same migration batch. And that will avoid broken scenarios. For example, a scenario where a boss and their delegate are moved in different migrations, and as a result, it's, say for instance, the bosses move first, that could break delegate access for the assistant to get to their mailbox, or vice versa. If you migrate the assistant first, that will also break delegate access at that point as well. So try to figure out who has delegate access to who else's mailbox and move them in the same batch at all times. Now, after you define and you create a batch by uploading the CSV file, it's at that point that you can go ahead and automatically or manually start the batch. And actually, once the batch is running, you also do have suspend and resume capabilities available to you as well. And when you start the batch, a user is going to have a new mailbox, and replication is going to happen later. And so what that means is that the user will already have this username and password that you've given to them. And they'll have the ability to log on, but because it's a new mailbox and replication might not have occurred yet, then they end up basically with an empty mailbox. And so that could take some time for their mail to come in. And if the user is someone who actually has a real need to have all their email as soon as they're logging back into their mailbox, that might actually drive you towards migrating their mailbox on the weekend or during off hours, so that not only can the mailbox be migrated, but you'll have time for the mail itself to replicate and start filling in their new mailbox as well. Otherwise, it might be quite a shock to them for them to suddenly log on with this new password and find themselves with an empty mailbox. If they do that, though, the good news is as they're in the mailbox, the data will stop flowing in and they'll see messages start to appear. And eventually, their complete mailbox will be available to them, excluding the things I mentioned before. Now, a significant difference between a staged and a cutover migration, or between staged and a cutover or IMAP migration, is that staged migrations don't have that email replication process. So all the emails will still arrive on premises because your MX record still points there during the migration, and then they'll be forwarded to the cloud recipient if that is where their mailbox is now located. So before the batch is created, the cloud user object that gets created by the DirSync process is going to be mail-enabled only. It's not going to be mailbox-enabled. And so when you start the batch, it's at that point that the user's cloud mailbox ends up being created. And it's at that point when DirSync will also set the target address appropriately on that on-premises object, which is then used for the redirection of the messages. Now, after the batch file is finished, it is a best practice to convert the on-premises user, their mailbox, you want to convert them to a mail-enabled user so that Outlook will automatically auto-discover the cloud mailbox and connect to it. Why? Well, one of the reasons is after stage migration, remember the user has an on-premises mailbox and now an Exchange Online mailbox. So now we've got their mailbox in two places. Because mail is sent to the user's on-premises mailbox, but it gets forwarded to their Exchange Online mailbox, the users have to connect to their Exchange Online mailbox in order to get their new mail. But if the user opens Outlook to connect to their on-premises mailbox, then AutoDiscover is still going to try to connect them to their on-premises mailbox. So that could be a challenge for the user. They might get thrashed around a bit in trying to connect to the wrong endpoint. So after you convert the mailbox to a mail-enabled user, it's at that point that the user can create a new profile, and once they've done that, then AutoDiscover will properly connect them up to the cloud-based mailbox. Now, another reason to do that is to retain the proxy addresses from the Exchange Online mailboxes by copying them to your mail-enabled users. And this will allow you to manage basically your cloud-based users from your on-premises organization. So again, you've got the choice of identity management here. But also, if you decide to decommission your on-premises Exchange org after all of your mailboxes are migrated, then the proxy addresses that you've copied to these mail-enabled users will still remain in your on-premises Active Directory as well. So you won't have a fear of losing that information when you rip out Exchange if you decide to do that. Now, finally, at the end, once all of your users have been migrated, you'll reconfigure your MX record and auto-discover to point to Office 365. And after that, should you desire, you can uninstall your on-premises Exchange servers. We do recommend making a backup before you do that. But you can keep it running for a longer period if you want. But of course, at that point, no one's going to be using it, and mail won't be flowing through it. So it'll basically be an inert server that shouldn't be doing anything at that point. And it's up to you if you want to keep that running or not, but generally, you're free to decommission that. And then after that point, DirSync can also be deactivated as well. And at that point, all of your users would be managed by you in Office 365 if you do decommission DirSync. All right, let's talk briefly about the deployment options for Office 365 Pro Plus. There's basically two ways to deploy the software to your clients. You can have them go to the Office 365 portal and have it be installed directly from that portal, or you can download the software locally and then have it be deployed to your users. The choice is yours. There's, again, no one right answer for every organization. But there are pros and cons to both methods. So for example, using the portal means a lot less burden and less administrative setup on your IT admins. And it does mean more self-service, but it does also mean less control for the IT department as well. Downloading and deploying the on-premises and having been deployed from an on-premises location does give you more control, but of course in doing so the trade-off is you increase the burden on the administrator to do these sorts of tasks. And so really it's going to be up to you as to which way that you want to go. And it might be perhaps if you're a large organization that is geographically distributed, and perhaps maybe bandwidth constrained, you might decide to, or bandwidth constrained in some locations, you might decide for some of the users, maybe in a well-connected location, they can go ahead and download and install it directly from the portal. Or in a less well-connected environment, those users might be directed to a share somewhere that's configured locally where they can just go ahead and install it from that location as well. You've got a wide variety of flexibility here, and really, again, you get to choose which one suits your organization best. All right, just a couple notes on the deployment options for mobile devices because those are so much easier. I just wanted to give you some links so that you've got instructions on how to do that. We've got detailed instructions at the top link there, and then both phone and tablet configuration instructions when you're doing it from the Office 365 admin portal at that link right there. Really, mobile devices are about the easiest clients to set up against Exchange Online. It could not really be easier than just putting in your username and password and having auto-discover on the Windows Phone finding that, or if you're not using Windows Phone, having just a quick server name or a connection endpoint, rather, to hand out to your users. All right, finally, let's just talk about some key deployment considerations. So I've mentioned this before, but I do want to reiterate because this is something that does trip up some customers, and that is all of the SMTP domains that you plan on using must be verified by Office 365 before you sync your users. And you won't be able to remove any domain that you've verified and have been using in the past until all of the synced objects that you have are no longer using that domain as part of either their UPN or as part of their SMTP address. Okay, so there are some restrictions there. We do also recommend that you verify that all on-premises users have correct non-null values for their UPN, which we would recommend preferably be their SMTP address as well. And the default routing domain, that is that onmicrosoft.com domain, that is used for the Office 365 UPN if the on-premises UPN does not contain a verifiable or routable DNS domain. So for instance, if you deployed a .local domain inside your organization, you won't be able to basically do anything with that. You'll be using the Office 365 on Microsoft.com as part of the UPN in that case. Hopefully, I would hope no one here is using a non-routable DNS domain like .local anymore. Does anybody fall into that category? All right. You don't want to raise your hands? Yeah. Well, there's a couple reasons. You know, we just talked about one of the reasons, but another reason is just about every public certification authority out there has stated that, and some have already done this, that they're no longer going to be issuing certificates for non-routable DNS domains. Okay, so what that means is if you want to use SSL against a .local domain or some other top-level domain that is not routable on the internet, you won't be able to do that using a public CA. You might be able to do that using your own internal PKI, but now you've created a world of complexity and a potential world of pain that prevents you possibly from going forward into new services and new software if you choose to go down that path. So if you are using one of those non-routable domains, or if you're a consultant and you run into customers who are using them, do yourself and do them a favor and move them out of that namespace and into something that is public and routable, even if they have no plans to route over the internet at this point. This will be this will help them set the stage for future work that they might need to do. All right, we also do recommend that you clean up Active Directory before implementing DirSync, and we've got a great tool called IDFix that can do that. This is particularly important if you have imported your directory information from a third-party directory into Active Directory. Not every directory service is the same, and we generally want you to make sure that Active Directory is clean and healthy and good to go before moving forward. And remember, also because it can take up to 24 hours before directory synchronization is enabled in the cloud, we recommend that you wait at least 24 hours before you start installing and using your DirSync compliance. And then, as I mentioned, because of that 300,000 object limit that we have, if you have more than 300,000 objects that you need to synchronize, you'll want to plan ahead and you'll want to put that support request in sooner rather than later, so that when you've hit object 300,000, you should already have the quota increase by that time, and you can move forward without any delay at that as well. I do also, in the notes on this slide, I do have a link to IDFix if you need to use it as well. And again, if you're not familiar with it, it's a tool that we've specifically created. It's a free downloadable tool from the Download Center. We've specifically created to allow you to do cleanup and remediation of your on-premises directory in preparation for a move to Office 365. So that's its sole purpose. If you have no plans to move to Office 365, there's really no point in using that tool. But if you are planning on moving, then you absolutely want to do some cleanup and run that tool and make sure that you're good to go. All right, and as I mentioned, there is a ton more information that is in these slides. I will make them available immediately after this session to the event owners, and eventually they'll make them available for you to download. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I know it's been a long day. Well, all right. Well, yeah, no, you're too late. Yeah, all right. Go ahead. I'll give you one. Yes, sure. You said please, of course.
You start with a password verification in DirSync.
Mm-hmm.
Then use of ADFS as an authentication method. Is that still
Well,
authentication in
yeah,
DirSync?
so in that case, you're going to be using ADFS. So the password sync at that point really wouldn't matter, because you're going to be federating your Active Directory, and we'll go back and verify that through the federation process.
The password in DirSync,
Yes.
what's the use of ADFS?
Well, so I mentioned some of the scenarios that you would use it for. So for instance, the federated scenario that I talked about. Another one would be if you had cross-premises search requirements in SharePoint. Those would be the driving reasons to use ADFS. Thank you. Well, all right. Well, thank you very much. And again, scott.schnoll@microsoft.com if you think of any questions afterwards, or if I've asked you to email me something I might not have known the answer to. All right. Thanks, and I hope you enjoyed TechX Office 365.